Memphis, summer of 1956. The air inside the community hall was thick with cigarette smoke and tension. A local judge, red-faced and furious, slammed his fist against the wooden table. His voice thundered across the room filled with anxious parents. Elvis Presley is a disgrace to America. His movements are indecent. His songs corrupt the morals of our children. If we allow this boy to lead them, we are leading them straight into ruin. The crowd erupted, some nodding in agreement, others whispering in shock. Reporters scribbled every word, their eyes gleaming with tomorrow's headlines. And indeed, by the next morning, newspapers across the South screamed the same accusation in bold black ink. For Elvis, only 21 and still finding his footing in fame, it was not just an insult, it was a public trial. A line had been drawn, the establishment on one side, his music, and the millions who believed in it on the other. What no one yet knew was that this clash, born in a small Memphis hall, would ignite a cultural battle that shook the entire nation. Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. The fall of 1956 had a strange heaviness in the air. America was humming with jukeboxes and restless teenagers, yet the older generation could barely hide their unease. In small towns, school boards met behind closed doors, drafting letters that demanded, "This noise, this shaking boy, is poisoning our children." In churches, sermons thundered that a 21-year-old from Tupelo was carrying the devil's rhythm into America's living rooms. Elvis had felt the pushback growing for months, but that evening in Memphis, the weight of it suddenly fell on him like a brick wall. He was still wearing the shimmering jacket from his stage set, beads of sweat drying on his temples, when a stagehand placed a folded newspaper into his hands. The headline screamed louder than the cheers he had just left behind. "Judge calls Presley a disgrace to America." He sank onto the worn sofa in his dressing room, the words burning into his eyes. The article quoted a respected state judge, a man whose authority carried weight far beyond the courtroom. The judge's words weren't casual insults. They were a verdict, delivered in public, aimed straight at his heart. This boy is a menace to morals, a shame to our nation's youth. Elvis crumpled the edge of the page. His knuckles turned white as he tightened his grip. The noise of the crowd outside faded. For the first time in months, he wasn't thinking about the screaming girls or the records flying off shelves. He was thinking about his mother, who would surely read this tomorrow morning at the kitchen table in Memphis. The phone rang sharply, slicing through the silence. He hesitated, then picked up. On the other end was Gladys, her voice trembling. "Elvis, baby, I read it already." They printed it everywhere. Her breath caught, and for a moment she couldn't speak. Then, in a rush, "They're saying they might not let you on television anymore." "What if they shut you down? What if—" "Mama, hey," he whispered, forcing calm into his tone even as his chest ached. "Don't you cry now. You taught me to sing in church. You know this ain't evil. It's just music." But she couldn't stop crying. For her, it wasn't just words on paper. It was fear that her boy's whole world might be snatched away by men in suits who didn't understand him. When he hung up, the dressing room felt smaller. He set the phone down slowly, but before he could catch his breath, another knock rattled the door. His manager's assistant stepped in, carrying a thin folder. The man's face was pale, uneasy. "Elvis," he began, "the producers of The Sullivan Show called. They're reconsidering. There's talk your contract could be pulled if the pressure keeps up." Elvis leaned forward, elbows on his knees. So one man in a robe decides what America can hear? His voice was low, steady, but sharp enough to cut glass. The assistant shrugged helplessly. Judges, politicians, church leaders, they're all piling on. Sponsors don't like the noise he wanted to shout, but instead he fell silent. His fingers found the strings of his guitar, plucking them absent-mindedly. The notes sounded lonely in the cramped room, like echoes of a prayer no one answered. That night, before leaving the venue, he opened a stack of letters piled on his dressing table. Most were fan mail, clumsy handwriting, lipstick kisses pressed into paper. He sifted through without much thought, until one envelope caught his eye. The writing was shaky, childlike, but the words inside pierced deeper than any insult could. Dear Elvis, they want to take your music away from us. Please don't stop. You are our voice when nobody listens to us. He read it twice, then a third time, until the lines blurred. He folded the note carefully, slipping it into his jacket pocket. It stayed there, pressed against his chest, as he walked out into the night, where fans still waited behind barricades, screaming his name as though the world hadn't just tried to bury him alive. On the ride back to his hotel, the city lights streaked past the car windows. For every billboard advertising his records, there was a preacher or a politician warning that he was leading America to ruin. Yet, in the middle of that storm, the letter burned like a lantern inside him. He was 21 years old, caught between the love of millions and the condemnation of authority. The nation was split down the middle. Parents versus children. Pulpits versus jukeboxes. Judges versus the boy from Tupelo. And Elvis, staring out at the dark highway, clenched his jaw. He didn't know yet how he would answer the judge, the sermons, the bands. But he knew one thing with absolute clarity. He would not give them his silence. The stage had only just been set for a battle larger than he had ever imagined. October 1956. The country's living rooms had become the new battleground. Families gathered around flickering television sets, expecting order, respectability, clean-cut smiles. And now, into that fragile space, Elvis Presley was about to step once more. The Ed Sullivan Show had invited him back, but not without conditions. Behind the stage curtains, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Studio executives shuffled papers, producers barked into headsets, and lawyers whispered warnings that seemed more like threats. Elvis sat quietly in a corner, guitar resting across his lap, his fingers moving over the strings without sound. His eyes were lowered, but inside, a storm churned. They had made the decision. Cameras would capture him only from the waist up. It was an unprecedented restriction, born of fear that his movements, the same ones that had electrified teenagers and horrified parents, would scandalize the nation if broadcast in full. For a medium that prided itself on control, this was their last defense against the chaos he seemed to represent. In the tense quiet of his dressing room, a man in a dark suit entered, carrying a stack of contracts. He introduced himself as a legal advisor for the show. His words were clipped, professional but cold. Mr. Presley, you need to understand. If you deviate from the producer's instructions, if you step even slightly outside what's permitted, we will cut you from the broadcast. This is your warning. Elvis nodded, but said nothing. The man mistook his silence for submission and left without another glance. Alone again, Elvis set his guitar across his knees and muttered under his breath, almost like a vow. They can cut my body in half with their cameras, but they can't cut my soul. Just then, a ripple of noise reached the dressing room window. Curious, he stood and pushed aside the curtain. Outside the studio, in the cool night air, dozens of fans were gathered with hand-painted signs. Most were scrawled with his name in bold strokes, but one banner in particular caught his eye. "Show them what being American really means." The words hit him with unexpected force. He thought of his father's long hours in menial jobs, his mother's tears over unpaid bills, the tiny shack in Tupelo where he had grown up. He wasn't the product of Hollywood or politics, he was their son, the boy who had clawed his way up from nothing. If they called that un-American, then perhaps they had forgotten their own roots. Minutes later, he was summoned to the stage. The crowd inside the theater roared as the announcer's voice boomed through the speakers. The studio lights were blinding, the cameras enormous, their red signals glowing like unblinking eyes. The band struck the opening chords of "Don't Be Cruel." Elvis gripped the microphone, forcing his voice into steadiness. He leaned into the rhythm, letting his tone carry the swing and the heat that his body, half hidden from the lens, could not. Even confined, he radiated energy, a defiance that spilled beyond the frame. His upper body swayed, his smile cracked wide, and though the cameras cut away from his legs, the audience in the theater shrieked as if they alone bore witness to a secret the rest of the nation was being denied. Something shifted in that moment. The restraint intended to diminish him only made his charisma blaze brighter. The television screen could not contain what pulsed through his voice. Across the country, families leaned closer to their sets, mothers pursing their lips while their children shouted along with the chorus. The divide grew sharper, but so did the recognition that something alive and unshakable was happening before their eyes. Backstage, when the performance ended, the producers exchanged uneasy glances. They had achieved their censorship, yet somehow the broadcast felt more explosive than anything they had feared. The next morning, the newspapers reflected the change. Where once the headlines had called him a scandal, they now admitted, begrudgingly or with awe, "Presley captivates nation," and "from shame to phenomenon." Even critics who despised him could not deny the sheer force of the reaction. Elvis read the clippings in silence. He didn't grin or gloat. He simply folded them, set them aside, and picked up his guitar once more. For him, it wasn't about silencing the judge or winning the press. Not yet. It was about proving that his music, his very presence, carried something that could not be trimmed by a camera angle or dismissed by a sermon. And in that realization, he felt something harden inside him, a conviction that this fight was only beginning. The nation had seen him censored, boxed in, treated as a danger. And yet, despite the attempt to cut him down, America had witnessed something it could not unsee. A young man whose very existence on their screens had become an act of rebellion, a symbol of freedom that resonated far beyond the stage. The judge had called him a disgrace. But after that night, millions of Americans whispered the opposite. They called him a revelation. By early 1957, the uproar had not died down. If anything, it had intensified. The more records Elvis sold, the louder the resistance became. Some pastors declared his concerts moral epidemics. Newspapers published editorials warning parents about the Presley plague. And the familiar voice of that same judge returned to the headlines, "We cannot allow this boy from Tupelo to stand as a model for American youth." Those words followed Elvis wherever he went. Into airports where photographers shoved flashbulbs in his face, onto stages where policemen stood ready to enforce decency codes, even into hotel rooms where piles of fan mail waited for him, stacked higher than the bed. Each night, he felt the collision between the roar of teenagers and the cold pronouncements of authority. Then came a call that surprised even him. A discreet invitation routed through his management. Representatives from the White House wanted a private conversation. No cameras, no reporters, just a quiet meeting in Washington to discuss the cultural climate. When Elvis arrived, dressed neatly in a dark suit that seemed to swallow his usual swagger, he was led into a paneled room where two presidential advisors waited. They were older men, their expressions guarded but curious. Elvis shifted in his chair, uncharacteristically shy in the solemn setting. One advisor began with a question delivered more gently than expected. "Mr. Presley, do you believe your music makes young people reckless?" Elvis hesitated, then spoke plainly. "Sir, music doesn't make people bad. It doesn't teach hate. It gives folks a way to feel less alone. That's all I ever wanted, to make somebody out there feel like they're not by themselves." For a moment, the room was quiet. The second advisor leaned back, studying him, then said in a low voice, meant only for Elvis, "Between us, son, you might just be our chance to show the world another side of America. Don't waste it." The weight of those words pressed on Elvis as he left the building. Outside, reporters caught wind of his visit, though they knew none of the details. Within days, scandalized headlines appeared. "Presley in the White House. Has America gone too far?" Columnists fumed that the nation's highest office had granted legitimacy to a singer they deemed obscene. Yet, at the same time, another story unfolded. A military veterans organization announced that Elvis would be honored with a certificate of appreciation for his benefit performances supporting U.S. servicemen. Photographs showed him receiving the award with a shy smile, his parents beaming proudly at his side. For many Americans, it was the first time they saw him not as a lightning rod for controversy, but as a young man capable of giving back. The paradox became sharper. On the front pages, one column called him a disgrace. On the next, he was pictured shaking hands with war heroes. To his critics, this was hypocrisy. To his fans, it was proof that he was more than the caricature painted by judges and ministers. In the midst of it all, Elvis felt the strain. At night in hotel rooms, he paced restlessly, torn between the tidal wave of adoration and the constant hammer of attacks. He confided to a close friend, "I never asked to be a symbol, man. I just wanted to sing. Now it feels like every song I sing is on trial." But the trial was no longer confined to the courtroom or the pulpit. It was taking place in the hearts of millions of Americans, each deciding whether the boy with the shaking voice was a danger or a promise. And with every performance, with every headline, that divide only deepened. In March 1958, the headlines shifted. Elvis Presley drafted into U.S. Army. For some, it was the ultimate test. For others, it was a chance to see the scandalous singer finally tamed. Among the loudest voices was the same judge who had haunted Elvis since his first television appearances. At a press conference, with cameras flashing and reporters scribbling, he declared, "This young man has a chance now to prove himself. The Army will make him a man, or expose him as nothing more than a fraud." The words spread like wildfire. Elvis read them while packing his duffel bag in Memphis. He set the clipping down slowly, then looked across the room at his father. "They think I'll ask for special treatment," he said, "but I don't want it. I'll do the same as every other boy," and he meant it. When offered the option of a cushy assignment entertaining troops, Elvis declined. He requested to serve in a regular armor unit with no special privileges. He wanted to stand shoulder to shoulder with ordinary draftees, even if it meant sleeping in crowded barracks and scrubbing floors. At Fort Hood, Texas, he arrived not as the king of rock and roll, but as Private Presley. The first nights were jarring. Gone were the stage lights and adoring screams. Instead, There were steel bunks, shouted orders, and the smell of sweat and dust. Yet Elvis adapted quickly. He stood in line at the mess hall, carried his own gear, and laughed with men who, at first, didn't know what to make of him. Sometimes, after lights out, he would take out his guitar and quietly strum a hymn or a blues tune. The barracks would fall into a hushed stillness as his voice, stripped of microphones and amplifiers, drifted through the darkness. Soldiers wrote letters home. "You wouldn't believe it, but Presley's one of us. He eats the same chow, does the same drills. At night, he sings soft like you never heard before." Meanwhile, the judge resurfaced in the papers again. "The Army is not a stage," he scoffed. "Let's see how long the boy lasts when the cameras are gone." But behind the bravado of uniformed life, Elvis was fighting battles the judge couldn't see. In August 1958, devastating news reached him. His mother, Gladys, was gravely ill. The Army granted emergency leave, and Elvis flew home to Memphis. When he entered the hospital room, he saw her frail, eyes clouded with pain. For years, she had been his anchor, the gentle voice that steadied him through every storm. Now, she was slipping away. On August 14th, she died at just 46 years old. At the funeral, thousands of fans gathered outside Graceland. But inside, Elvis collapsed into tears. He clutched her photograph against his chest, inconsolable. Reporters who once mocked him described a broken son. Presley, the idol, revealed himself simply as a boy grieving his mother. Even some of his harshest critics softened, writing that fame and scandal meant little in the face of such loss. When he returned to duty, he carried himself differently, quieter, more solemn, but resolute. He trained harder, volunteered for extra tasks, and refused to let grief excuse him from soldiering. His fellow recruits respected him for it. Letters to newspapers began to paint a new picture. Elvis the soldier, not Elvis the menace. Still, the judge would not relent. In one interview, he sneered, "Don't mistake temporary discipline for redemption. America deserves better idols than a boy who wiggles on stage." But Elvis, standing in formation under the Texas sun, no longer seemed shaken by those barbs. The Army had grounded him in a way fame never had. Among the clatter of boots and shouted drills, he discovered a sense of belonging that no courtroom condemnation could strip away. For the first time, America began to glimpse him not just as the rebel who set girls screaming, but as a young man willing to sacrifice comfort for duty. The judge's voice still echoed in the papers, but against the steady march of boots and the silent memory of his mother, it no longer sounded as powerful. When Elvis stepped off the plane in 1960, after 2 years of Army service, America greeted him with open arms. Crowds gathered at airports, reporters shoved microphones at his face, and magazines declared, "The King is back." Even some critics admitted he had returned more mature, more disciplined. For the first time, the young man who had once been painted as a danger now stood as something closer to a national figure. But behind the cheers and banners, another kind of machinery was already waiting. His manager, Colonel Tom Parker, had prepared a mountain of contracts. Hollywood studios saw in Elvis not the raw musician who had electrified a generation, but a product. A handsome figure who could sell movie tickets, soundtracks, and merchandise. At first, Elvis was excited. He loved the idea of acting, of challenging himself in a new way. His first films after the Army, like G.I. Blues and Flaming Star, drew big audiences. Fans filled theaters, eager to see him in uniform or cowboy boots. The money poured in, and the studios were pleased. But soon the pattern emerged. Script after script landed in his hands, each one thinner than the last. plots recycled, songs shoehorned into flimsy storylines. Elvis found himself on sound stages, singing forgettable numbers to plastic sets, forced to repeat lines that felt empty. By the mid-60s, he was making 3 movies a year, sometimes 4, each one more formulaic than the last. On set, he smiled for the cameras, delivered the lines, and sang the songs. But when the director yelled, "Cut!" his expression fell flat. To friends, he confessed, "I'm not singing for people anymore." "I'm just a picture on a screen," the press noticed. Articles that once celebrated his every move now began to sneer. "The King fades into Hollywood routine," and "Presley reduced to pretty face." Even fans who adored him sensed something was wrong. His concerts, once his heartbeat, had vanished. Instead of live performances, the only way to see him was in theaters, trapped in lightweight films that lacked the fire of his earlier years. The judge, never missing a chance, returned to the public stage. "See what's happened?" he told reporters. "Once a disgrace, now a puppet for Hollywood. This is not art. This is business dressed up in sequins." Elvis read those words late one night in his trailer. He set the paper aside, staring at the mirror. His reflection was framed by makeup lights, but his eyes were tired. He whispered to himself, "I didn't come this far just to pose." Inside the studio circles, voices urged him to accept his fate. "You're making millions," one producer told him. "Concerts are old news. Movies keep you in the public eye. Why risk it?" But deep down, the hunger gnawed at him. He missed the pulse of the crowd, the rush of sweat and sound that no film could replicate. He remembered the nights in Memphis when he had sung simply because he had to, because the music was bigger than his body. Now he felt caged, sold piece by piece in Technicolor. Then came a breaking point. A new script arrived, another lightweight comedy, with yet another forgettable soundtrack. Colonel Parker encouraged him to sign, calling it easy money. Elvis stared at the pages, flipping through cardboard characters and paper-thin songs. He closed the folder, pushed it back across the desk, and said quietly but firmly, "I'm not doing it. I won't be just a picture. I've got to sing again." The room went silent. For the first time in years, he had defied the machine that surrounded him. It was a small act, barely noticed by the public. But to Elvis, it was a declaration of war. Not against Hollywood, not even against the judge who mocked him, but against the slow erosion of his own soul. Behind the facade of glamour, the king was preparing to reclaim his crown. And though no one knew it yet, the spark of that rebellion would soon ignite the greatest comeback of his life. By 1968, the once unstoppable force of Elvis Presley seemed dimmed. The charts were filled with new names: the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, Motown stars who carried the energy of the decade. Elvis, meanwhile, was stuck in a carousel of formula films, each one more forgettable than the last. Critics spoke of him in the past tense, as though he had already been eclipsed. But NBC approached with an idea: a Christmas television special. At first, executives wanted something light-hearted: staged holiday numbers, family-friendly skits, safe and predictable. Elvis listened politely, then set the papers down. For years, he had obeyed, smiled, and delivered. This time, he shook his head. "If this is my chance back on television," he said firmly, "I'm going to do it my way." Rehearsals began in a small studio. Stripped of glamour, Elvis walked in wearing black leather from head to toe. A daring choice, sleek, raw, and unlike the glossy costumes of his movie years. The outfit hugged him like armor, turning him back into the rebel the public remembered, but older now, hardened by disappointment. In the wings, a journalist reminded him of the words from 1956, the judge who had declared, "Presley is a disgrace to America." The comment lingered like smoke. Elvis paused, guitar slung low across his chest, and for a moment the weight of the years pressed down. He could almost hear his mother's voice, see her tears, recall the hollow films, the headlines calling him finished. Then he stepped onto the stage. The lights flared, the audience pressed close, and with a sudden strike of his guitar, he launched into Heartbreak Hotel. His voice, rougher than in his youth but sharper, carried a raw urgency that silenced the room. Gone was the Hollywood puppet. Here was the man who had once set the nation aflame. He sang seated among his original bandmates, sweat glistening on his forehead, laughter breaking out between verses as he traded jokes with the crowd. The atmosphere was intimate, electric, as if time itself had rewound to the mid-50s, but heavier, charged with the knowledge of loss and survival. Viewers at home felt it instantly. The television audience expected a safe holiday special, but what they got was an eruption. Elvis snarling through Trouble, pouring fire into Lawdy Miss Clawdy, and crooning ballads with such tenderness that families fell silent in their living rooms. The next day, headlines screamed with awe, "Presley reborn! The King lives!" Ratings shattered records. Across the nation, critics who had dismissed him now admitted they had witnessed something extraordinary. Yet the judge could not resist one more strike. In an interview, when asked if he had seen the performance, he replied curtly, "Yes, and my opinion remains unchanged. America deserves more than this spectacle." His words appeared in black ink once again, a sour note beneath the chorus of praise. But this time, Elvis did not flinch. Backstage, after the cameras went dark, he sat quietly in his dressing room, still wearing the black leather suit, drenched in sweat. He closed his eyes, hearing the echo of applause that had rattled the rafters. For the first time in years, he felt alive. Not as a movie star, not as a product, but as a musician, as a man. He turned to one of his closest friends and said simply, This is what I was born to do. No matter what they write, no matter what they say." In that moment, the judge's voice became background noise. America had just witnessed a resurrection, and Elvis knew it. The comeback wasn't just about reclaiming a stage. It was about defying every attempt to bury him, every headline that had pronounced him irrelevant, every sneer that had branded him a disgrace. The boy from Tupelo had walked through the machine, the army, the grief, the ridicule, and emerged once again, guitar in hand, ready to fight on his own terms. The black leather wasn't just a costume, it was armor, and under its shine, Elvis was reborn as the king once more. The summer of 1969 burned hot in Nevada. Las Vegas, once a playground for crooners in tuxedos, was about to witness something entirely different. The International Hotel, gleaming and massive, had booked Elvis Presley for a series of shows that would either cement his return or expose him as a relic of another era. When the curtain lifted on opening night, the room erupted. Elvis strode out in a white jumpsuit encrusted with jewels, cape glinting under the lights. The orchestra behind him swelled with brass and strings, his voice cut through the hall like a blade, and the audience, gamblers, tourists, die-hard fans and critics alike, were swept away. For weeks, the theater overflowed. Every performance became an event. People lined the streets, celebrities flew in from Los Angeles, and newspapers declared, "Presley rules Vegas." The king, it seemed, was not only alive, but larger than ever. Yet with the applause came a familiar echo. The judge, who had shadowed him for more than a decade, gave another interview. His words were clipped, dismissive. "This is no triumph. This is circus entertainment for tourists. America has turned its so-called idol into a cheap attraction." The sting of those words reached Elvis backstage after a sold-out show. He tossed the paper aside, wiping sweat from his face, his cape heavy over his shoulders. Turning to his bandmates, he muttered, "They want to see me as a cartoon. But I'll show them. These songs are real." Night after night, he poured himself into the performances. Between the flash of rhinestones and the roar of the orchestra, he carved out moments that silenced even his critics. One evening, as the crowd thundered for more, he noticed a woman in the front row clutching a photograph of her son, a young soldier killed in Vietnam. Elvis stopped the show, asked for the house lights, and dedicated "Bridge Over Troubled Water" to her boy. The theater fell into a hush. When his voice broke on the final note, the mother's tears mirrored dozens around her. The story reached the press the next day. Headlines that once mocked him now carried phrases like, "Presley moves Vegas audience to tears." Even hardened columnists admitted that amid the glitter and glamour, he still had the power to strike at the heart. But the judge did not relent. He announced he would deliver a lecture in Memphis on the dangerous influence of Presley and the decay of youth morals. The timing was deliberate, coming just as Elvis's Vegas run hit its stride. Reporters played up the contrast, the king dazzling crowds in Nevada, while his oldest critic sharpened his attacks back home. Inside the International Hotel, Elvis ignored the public feud as best he could. Yet in quiet moments, he admitted to friends that the weight never disappeared. "No matter what I do," he said softly, "he'll never see past the boy shaking on stage in '56. Still, when the spotlight hit him, all hesitation burned away. In Las Vegas, he found a strange kind of freedom. The vast stage allowed him to command an army of musicians, to blend rock with gospel, blues with ballads, country with show tunes. His body moved with the same instinctive rhythm as in his youth, but now it carried the weight of years, grief, and resilience. The crowd felt it, and they responded with devotion. As 1969 turned to the early 70s, the shows grew bigger, brighter, more extravagant. The rhinestone suits became legend, the karate kicks part of his nightly ritual. But beneath the spectacle, he never forgot the quieter truths. More than once, he stopped mid-performance to talk to the audience, to tell a story about his mother or about the old days in Tupelo. Those moments reminded fans that beneath the legend stood a man still searching for meaning. The judge's lecture drew headlines, but failed to outshine the roar of Vegas. His words were harsh, yet for the first time they felt like an echo from another era. A voice clinging to the past, while the future screamed with applause in a desert casino. And Elvis, standing center stage, with sweat dripping and cape spread wide, sang louder than the condemnation. Each note was defiance. Each ovation was proof that, no matter what the critics wrote, the people had already chosen their king. The dawn of the 1970s carried both promise and unease. Elvis was back in the public eye, his Las Vegas shows the talk of the nation, but he wanted something more than applause. The country was in turmoil. Vietnam protests on college campuses, drug culture spreading, distrust of politicians deepening. Elvis felt restless, convinced that his fame could serve a purpose beyond entertainment. That conviction took him to the White House in December 1970. Wearing a purple velvet suit, a wide belt, and a gold cross around his neck, he stepped into the most formal building in America. He carried with him a handwritten letter he had sent only days earlier to President Richard Nixon, offering his services in the fight against narcotics. The meeting was surreal. In the Oval Office, Nixon sat stiffly behind the desk, a mixture of bemusement and calculation on his face. Elvis, nervous but determined, explained that young people looked up to him, and he wanted to help steer them away from drugs. He asked for something specific, a badge from the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs. For a moment, silence hung in the room. Then Nixon, perhaps seeing the political advantage of embracing a cultural icon, nodded. The badge was arranged. A photographer captured the unlikely handshake between the rock and roll star and the president. That photo would later become one of the most requested images in the National Archives. To Elvis, the moment was sincere. He believed the badge gave him a way to contribute, to be more than a singer. But outside, interpretations split sharply. Some saw a patriot stepping up in turbulent times. Others dismissed it as eccentric theater, a fading star desperate for relevance. The judge, never silent, seized the moment with relish. "A symbol of America?" he barked to reporters. "No, he's a clown asking for toy trinkets. If that's patriotism, then we've lost our way." The jab stung, not because Elvis expected praise from him, but because it cheapened something he felt deeply. One evening, sitting with close friends in his suite at the International Hotel, he spoke with uncharacteristic weariness. "They don't see what I'm trying to do. I'm not asking for attention. I'm trying to save lives. These kids out there, they're falling. And if I can be the one to pull them back, even a little, isn't that worth it?" Instead of retreating, Elvis doubled down. He organized benefit concerts, directing proceeds toward veterans returning from Vietnam. In one performance, he dedicated entire sets to servicemen seated in the front rows, shaking their hands, draping scarves around their shoulders as the crowd roared. The response was overwhelming. For the veterans, many of whom had faced hostility upon returning home, Elvis's embrace was more than a gesture. It was validation, recognition that they mattered. Newspapers carried images of young soldiers with tears streaming down their faces as Elvis sang an American trilogy. But the nation's press remained divided. One columnist wrote, "Presley, once condemned, now embodies American resilience." Another, echoing the judge's sneer, claimed, "Elvis plays dress-up as a patriot while hiding in casinos." The tension spilled into the streets. Fans organized petitions demanding recognition of Elvis's contributions, collecting signatures by the thousands. They framed him not as a fading star, but as a cultural force who gave voice to both joy and pain. Meanwhile, Elvis pressed on. His performances grew more elaborate, but in quiet moments backstage, he still wrestled with doubt. The black leather Defiance of 1968 had become jeweled jumpsuits, but the heart beneath remained the same. A boy from Tupelo who wanted to prove he was worthy of the stage, the uniform, the flag. The judge's condemnations lingered in print, but for every insult there was a counterpoint. The voice of a fan, a veteran, a child clutching his autograph. America was arguing with itself. Was Elvis Presley a hollow distraction or a living symbol of its contradictions, its hopes, its fight to hold on to unity? And in the middle stood Elvis, sweating under the stage lights, whispering in his dressing room, "They can call me whatever they want, but I know why I'm here." The stage was set for the confrontation that would decide it all. Not in courts or pulpits, but in the arena where his voice still commanded silence, then thunder. By 1972, the struggle between admiration and condemnation reached its peak. Elvis Presley had become both everywhere and nowhere, on stages in Las Vegas dazzling thousands nightly, on billboards advertising albums, in headlines that alternated between praise and mockery. But the question persisted. Was he a cultural beacon or a national embarrassment? The judge, now older but still loud, delivered what he framed as his final verdict. At a civic gathering in Memphis, before a packed auditorium of parents and officials, he thundered into the microphone, "Elvis Presley remains the worst thing to happen to American youth. His gyrations, his hollow patriotism, his circus in Las Vegas, they have poisoned a generation. We should never mistake noise for greatness." The words reverberated across newspapers. To Elvis, they were not new, but their timing stung. He was preparing for one of the most significant concerts of his career, Madison Square Garden in New York City. 3 sold-out nights in the most famous arena in the country. The weight of expectation pressed on his shoulders like armor. And yet, beyond the music, there was a deeper urgency, a need to answer, once and for all, the verdict that had chased him for 16 years. On June 10th, he walked onto the Garden stage, lights blazing, the crowd a sea of faces and flashbulbs. The opening chords thundered, his voice rose with ferocity, and from the first song, the audience knew this was not Vegas spectacle. It was revelation. He moved with energy that seemed to defy gravity, sweat glistening, every note carrying both triumph and defiance. Halfway through the set, he paused. The band fell silent. He stepped forward, gripping the microphone, his breathing heavy. The arena hushed. Cameras whirred, reporters leaned in, fans waited. His voice, low at first, carried a tremor that steadied into strength. "I was just a kid from Tupelo. They called me names. Disgrace, sinner, danger. They tried to make me believe I was less than the songs I sang. But let me tell you something." He lifted his head, eyes sweeping across the packed arena. "If singing for millions, if giving people hope, if making them feel less alone, if that is disgrace, then I'll carry it proudly for the rest of my days. Because I love my country. I love the people in it, and no one can take that from me." For a heartbeat, silence gripped the garden. Then the sound exploded, a roar so deafening it rattled the rafters. People leapt to their feet, clapping, crying, shouting his name. Some waved flags, others simply stood frozen, tears streaming. The ovation lasted long minutes, refusing to fade. Backstage after the show, Elvis sat down, drenched, exhausted, but with a faint smile tugging at his lips. A journalist approached carefully, asking if he had prepared those words. Elvis shook his head. "No," he said quietly. "That came from here." He tapped his chest. The next morning, newspapers across America carried the story. Words that shook Madison Square Garden. "Presley defies his critics." Even writers who had once dismissed him now admitted something had changed. One columnist confessed, "Last night, Elvis Presley did more than sing." He stood as a man. The judge, when asked for comment, refused. He had no statement, no rebuttal. No. The silence was telling. For the first time, his voice seemed drowned out by the echo of a single moment. A declaration that had risen above decades of sneers. For Elvis, it wasn't victory in the conventional sense. It was release. He had carried the weight of condemnation since 1956, through bans, ridicule, military service, Hollywood contracts, Vegas excess. At Madison Square Garden, he laid it down in front of the world, turning insult into badge, disgrace into honor. The boy from Tupelo, mocked, feared, adored, had given his last word. And it was not anger, not bitterness, but love, fierce and unyielding. That night, the king didn't just sing. He reclaimed his name, not as a scandal or a sideshow, but as a symbol of resilience, of human dignity, of the unbreakable bond between an artist and his people. And though the years ahead would bring their own shadows, nothing could erase the roar of that crowd or the truth in his voice when he said he would carry the so-called disgrace, not as shame, but as a crown.